The Trace's Jennifer Mascia on what to realistically expect on guns from a Trump or Harris administration. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and check out our free weekly newsletter today. I'm as well a CNN contributor. So you can see me on there occasionally from time to time talking about gun policy. But we take a sober, serious approach to the news here at The Reload, and we try to bring in people from a lot of different perspectives. And I will say, I was looking back at some of our recent podcasts, especially on issues surrounding the election, which is this episode is going to go up for the public on Monday. So the election will be the next day. So our last one before the election. And, you know, we have had a variety of perspectives for sure with folks like David French and Tim Miller and Ed Morrissey. But they tend to be kind of from different parts of the right, if that I think is a pretty fair description of it. So I wanted to get somebody who is from a different perspective than that. Not necessarily somebody who is a political pundit or anything like that, but come from an outlet that takes a different view of things than The Reload or Hot Air or The Bulwark or the New York Times or any of those places. And so that is why I've invited on Jennifer Mascia from The Trace to be with us for this episode, where we're going to explore what the realistic possibilities for gun policy are under either a Harris administration or another Trump administration. So welcome to the show, Jennifer. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. And first off, let's just start off with a little bit about The Trace itself for people who don't know about it, or for people who maybe even are critical of it. Some people in my audience, I think, are pretty critical of The Trace. And so I want to just give you some time to talk about your view. You've been there since the very founding, right?
Yes, I have.
And The Trace is a nonprofit newsroom, a news organization that covers gun violence and gun policy in the United States, right? And it has received funding from Everytown, at least at certain points in its past, which is disclosed on the website. I think the president of Everytown is also the president of The Trace as well. So, what is your view of how do you think people should look at what The Trace does and what it is and the work that it puts out?
Thanks. So after Sandy Hook, I was working at the New York Times, and I was an assistant for a columnist there who, there was no gun violence archive. There was nobody was monitoring daily shootings. So we ended up doing a project for 16 months where we just monitored shootings in the news, no commentary, no opinion. We just put a sentence about each of them. And at the end of that project, about 10 years ago exactly, some people from Everytown for Gun Safety took me to lunch and said, listen, there should be a news site just for gun violence, like the Marshall Project is criminal justice or Kaiser is health news. Why isn't there one? And we have money and we want to create that. Now, of course, I was very apprehensive. I'm a journalist. I went to journalism school. I don't protest. I don't advocate for things in public, and I'm not a PR person. So I was nervous. I said, look, I'm a journalist, and I don't want to, once you cross over into advocacy or PR, that's kind of the end of your credibility as a journalist. But what happened was I took a chance, and I wanted to keep covering this topic. And so what they did was they set aside funding for us, and we hired a staff of journalists who had never been advocates. They didn't even cover guns before this. And we formed a site. There were like 7 of us in a room, and Charleston happened. So immediately we were, baptism by fire. We were covering this mass shooting. And what we do is we try to cover this from all sides. Now, there are several staffers who own guns, some who own quite a few, which is good. I think that you should know what guns are and how to shoot them. I've been shooting. To cover this topic, we have had op-eds from hunters. We have sources in the NRA, not as many as you perhaps, but we do. And they feel like they can trust us. We have a reporter who speaks with them quite frequently. We really try to understand how Americans feel about guns. We've taken a lot of heat, and I understand that. It's good to be skeptical. It really is. Everytown is now a third of our funding. The president of Everytown is still listed on as our president. I can tell you, I have not seen him personally in 10 years. I've never met Michael Bloomberg. And the person who speaks to him on our staff doesn't have anything to do with editorial. So we are really separated. We're like a little bubble, and we keep hiring journalists from the Los Angeles Times, from the Philadelphia Inquirer. These are people who are not advocates. And again, some of them are gun owners, and we really try to understand. We talk to people. Why do you carry guns? Tell us about that. And a lot of people really feel like they carry guns for protection. That includes people in high crime areas, young Black youth. They feel like they need to carry guns for protection. So we really want to understand that and communicate that.
Yeah. Yeah. And, just to put cards on table here, right? Like you're doing, the Reload, right, is wholly owned by me. We don't have investors or donors or things like that. It's a different setup legally, right? It's a for-profit news publication, but that I own, and that we make our income from our members. Right. But so we operate a little bit differently in that way. But obviously, like I just talked about some of this on the news update. But, I have my own personal views and my personal background. I'm a gun owner. I like to build guns. I like to shoot. I'm a gun safety instructor, NRA certified, in basic pistol. Not that that's a super rare thing by any means, but and so like I have my own perspective, and I'm more well sourced, I would say, in the gun rights movement, which is another reason why I think your perspective on the show can be valuable for our listeners. I think it's good for us to lay these things out and people understand, where things are coming from and how this stuff is made, right, and the different points of view or perspectives that we are originating from, and also that you, I think, are more well sourced in the gun control or gun safety, I think is the preferred term over there, movement. So I think it'll be valuable in a discussion here about what we think is the likely outcome of either of these candidates winning. That's where I find you'll probably have a little bit different view on it and have a little different reporting on this front. And so I think it'll be a good discussion. So let's start off right with, you just had a piece right on the Trace that went through some of the likely outcomes if Donald Trump wins and becomes president again. I think we'll start off with the most likely outcomes, right? First, so if Trump wins, the most likely makeup of government will probably be full Republican control of Congress with Trump in the presidency. But it'll be a slim majority, most likely, if that happens, maybe 51, 52, if the Republicans get lucky, sort of balance in the Senate, and then probably a couple seat majority in the House as well. Not a huge majority, but one that's maybe a little more workable than their current one. I don't know. We'll see. But Republican control everything. In that scenario, I would still imagine it'll be fairly hard for them to get legislation through of a significant value. Like that'll put in significant changes on the pro-gun side of things. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, so there are several Republican priorities. There have been bills introduced in the House for the past several years. National concealed carry reciprocity is one of them. Right. Taking silencers out of the National Firearms Act is another.
Yeah.
How much traction they can get is the question. Would Republicans, if they ran the Senate, be willing to set aside the filibuster to pass these priorities?
Right. That's kind of the big question, right? Because I don't think there's any path where they're going to get 60 votes on either of those things, right?
Right. Either party is not, it's going to be a squeaker in the Senate once again. So that's really the question. What can they get through Congress? I don't think that changes significantly, even with Trump in the White House. And of course, it's worth mentioning when Trump was in the White House the last time, we had a bump stock ban, and he actually encouraged red flag laws. He seemed like he was receptive to the idea of red flag laws, whether that's incentivizing states. I don't think you're going to hear much from him about requiring. That language is not really something Republicans support.
Right.
But
yeah. Yeah. I mean, you actually pointed out in a previous piece that you did in September, looking at the same question of what's the likely policy outcome of either administration. And you noted something that I'd actually forgotten, but the post-Parkland roundtable that Trump held with lawmakers, where he expressed support for some sort of red flag law legislation, infamously saying, take the guns first, have due process second, which is sort of a pretty significant misunderstanding of what due process is. But regardless, that bill never came to fruition, but during this discussion, there was a suggestion from Steve Scalise that they should include national reciprocity, which Trump has said he supports and would sign, into a sort of compromise bill alongside perhaps a red flag law, national red flag law project of some sort. And Trump said no in that discussion, much to the very open happiness of Dianne Feinstein at the time. Now, again, to be clear, this didn't actually come to fruition. There was no national reciprocity, there was no national reciprocity, but there was also no red flag law. I think that was largely because shortly after that roundtable, the first impeachment happened, and that kind of derailed any possibility of bipartisan movement on gun policy. But, it does kind of make you wonder, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this. I've mentioned this before, but in a scenario where Trump is in the White House and Republicans control Congress, it is perhaps more likely that they'll pass pro-gun legislation than if Harris was in, right? But it's also, I think there may be more practical path to passing new gun restrictions as well, mainly in the wake of a major mass shooting, because that's when Trump has wavered on these things when he was president. Now, since leaving office, maybe his views have changed on this. Maybe he's less willing to cooperate or compromise. I don't know. What do you think?
Right. At the end of the day, Trump is a New York conservative. And having lived in New York City for 30 years, I can tell you that conservatives in New York, they draw the line when it comes to guns. They do not share the same beliefs as their, brethren in Texas, for instance. Conservatives in New York really do believe in some gun restrictions because that's what they're really used to up here. And I think that at the end of the day, Trump is like a New York conservative. I mean, he used to be more liberal, and now he's really operating from a point of there's only so far New York conservatives are willing to go on guns. And that just might be when he was last in office, we saw him come up against the edge of that. The truth is that when these things happen, you hear a tone from Trump that's actually sympathetic in a way. Like, I know he said some insensitive things like people should just get over shootings. But the truth is when pressed on these things, he's like, I'm always surprised because he is kind of like, let's be reasonable here, and he brings that New York perspective, and it's like, oh, there it is. There's the line. And so it is possible we could get a bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which John Cornyn sponsored. And even though he's not happy about how some of that has gone, we could talk about that in a minute. But I think you might see that where it's not requirements, but incentives for states to adopt certain policies. I could see something like that, like a compromise bill, especially after, God forbid, if there's another event like that, a major mass shooting.
Yeah, I mean, I just think his rhetoric doesn't always quite match his record on the willingness to consider more gun restrictions specifically in the wake of a major mass shooting. Because there was also a report that after the El Paso shooting, he considered supporting assault weapons ban. Now, there is also the factor that he does have lend more of an open ear to the NRA and other gun rights advocates, and he has not, outside of the bump stock ban, which the NRA supported to up to a point at least.
And he was tight with Wayne, and Wayne LaPierre is not there anymore. So I am curious to see how that relationship would play out now with new players. And
he did just cancel an NRA rally in Georgia for this. I was thinking it was supposed to be this week. So as we're recording here on Friday, but Friday of November 1st. But so how much sway the NRA still has over him is also another question. Although, look, I don't want us to pretend like this is like any sort of guarantee. This is just something you can notice in his record that he gets a little more willing to consider gun restrictions in the immediate aftermath of mass shootings.
And he won't be running again. So he could really do whatever he wants.
In theory, yeah. So
we'll see.
But at the same time, while there is maybe that possibility for legislative action in the wake of in this very specific kind of moment, which again didn't actually result in any new, other than the bump stock ban, which was in the realm of what we're about to talk about here, executive action stuff. Other than that, no legislation passed with new gun restrictions under Trump. Just to be clear, I'm just talking about the tendency he had after some of these mass shootings to express interest in doing that. But your piece that you just published focuses much more, because the legislative stuff, I think it's pretty much the same story for Harris, who is the most likely outcome if she wins is she'll have to face a Republican controlled Senate anyway. That's very unlikely to send her any sort of new gun restrictions. During her at least first 2 years in office.
And certainly not an assault weapon ban. I mean, I know that is one of her priorities, but that at this point, it's pretty much a non-starter.
Yeah. So I guess just to finish up on the legislative side, if Harris wins, she's likely going to have a Republican Congress, Republican Senate at least, maybe a Democratic House. But do you foresee any realistic possibility that at least for those first 2 years before we get another election of any real gun, on either side, honestly, any gun movement legislatively, if she wins? I think on the federal level,
it's pretty much stalled. I was surprised when the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act even passed. And I was surprised it passed with so much Republican support. I had actually been quoted as saying, you will not see any federal legislation, which is why you never predict. But and I'm glad nobody brought that up.
You never really know. And again, major mass shootings tend to move the needle on these things. It can be hard to predict whether they'll move it enough to get something across the line or not. But I mean, honestly, even with, you might see stunt bills, but they're unlikely to, either Harris would probably veto them. Even if you could, I mean, even stunt bills, pro-gun stunt bills probably wouldn't make it through either, right? Because you'd need 60 votes for most of those things.
Unless the Senate is a Republican Senate and decides to get rid of the filibuster, which it does for certain things, that will be interesting.
Yeah, obviously that's the kind of the wild card in all these discussions is like Harris has supported nuking the filibuster for legislation, or at least for some legislation. I guess she wants carve outs or something, which is kind of effectively just the end of the filibuster, I would say. But I mean, it's much harder to predict what would happen in those scenarios. Right. But assuming that the filibuster remains, it's hard to imagine any real major gun legislation getting through under either of these presidents, right?
Correct. I mean, the low hanging fruit is universal background checks, and Biden has kind of tried to do a backdoor UBC bill with that executive order, which we'll talk about in a minute. So I don't even think that's it's all a non-starter pretty much. It's really the action is happening in the courts, the state level, and executive orders.
Yeah. So let's move on to that stuff then, because I think we're in agreement on legislation barring major changes to either our gun politics or the way that our federal government currently functions, which is possible, right? I don't want to discount those possibilities, but barring those things happening, pretty much we're probably not getting much gun legislation one way or the other under either of these presidents.
Right.
But that's not all a president does. So first off, let's start with courts, with judge appointments, right? That's a big part of what the president does and has a huge impact on gun policy, as we've seen at the Supreme Court of late with Bruen and Rahimi and these different decisions that they've handed down, even the bump stock ban being struck down, not under the Second Amendment, but still having a major impact on gun policy. I would imagine that if Trump wins and has a Republican Senate, you'd expect him to start. Do you see any reason to think he would act any differently than he did in his first term? Or you just expect him to appoint the same sort of judges that he did then?
He's going to appoint judges and appoint them quickly. And whoever winds up leading a Republican Senate is going to be his partner in that, just like Mitch McConnell was. So President Trump did an interview with America's First Freedom magazine. Actually, a member of his team answered a number of questions about his gun priorities in the latest issue of America's First Freedom. And the first thing they mentioned was the federal courts at every level. He pointed out, I think he said 60% of the courts now are Biden appointments. It's really, really important for them at every level, not just the Supreme Court, to get pro-gun judges in, because that is where the action is. As we've seen since Bruen, it opened the floodgates for challenging laws, and different courts are coming out with different things. And, you don't even need a circuit split anymore to get it up to the Supreme Court. So that's really going to be that mechanism, that channel, just all along the line. Republicans, as far as the eye can see, is the goal in the courts.
Right. And you don't see any reason to believe he'd act any differently as far as like the ideological makeup of these judges this time around?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's fair and accurate and something that is probably his strongest bona fide from a pro-gun point of view, right?
Yeah.
And is probably his biggest negative from a pro-gun control point of view, right?
Right.
This is where the real impact is, these judge appointments. And so going to Harris is a little bit interesting question, right? Because the most likely outcome, if she wins, still seems to be that Republicans take the Senate.
Yes.
And so she'd have to deal with a Republican Senate when it comes to judge appointments. What do you think that would look like?
That's going to look like a lot of obstruction. It's funny. There are Republicans, like I remember Lindsey Graham. He was like, look, if a president is going to, recommend a judge, 9 times out of 10, they're qualified, and he would just send them through because that's advise and consent, right? You have some the Senate tends to be more sober than the House. The Republicans are a little bit more moderate, a little bit more practical and reasoned. And so, you might have pockets of obstruction. I can't see that every single Republican is going to want to fight her, but it depends on, that's way more, the House would do something like that, but it really depends on where the election leads the MAGA movement, like where in government we see the vestiges of Trump's, loyalty to Trump. Because I assume if he does not win this election, he will definitely still be in political life. His daughter-in-law runs the RNC. There's no reason to think that he would not run in 2028. I've heard it all online. So it really depends. The future of the MAGA movement depends on how much obstruction really you're going to see in Congress.
Yeah. I definitely think that you're right that as far as the tenor of the Senate when it comes to judge appointments has really changed over the years. And moved away from the idea that, if they're qualified, it doesn't matter that they're come from a very different ideological point of view than I do. I'm going to still vote to accept their nomination. And it's become way more politicized in that time. I think from both sides of it, Harry Reid was the first to nuke the filibuster on judge appointments. And then McConnell followed that up and expanded it to the Supreme Court, and it's just been kind of a race to the bottom on that front since then. And so, I would imagine it would be similar to what we see now with Biden's appointments, except that there won't be the ability to tie break with the vice president. And you have to rely on, at least for the more controversial appointments, which may be how many appointments are controversial has certainly expanded over the years. But at least for those, you may not be able to get 50 Republicans you only need one or two Republicans, obviously, to cross over. And there are people like Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski or Mitt Romney who may be more willing to do something like that for a lot of judges. But that kind of leads me to think she may be limited in who she can put up. She might want to try and put up more moderate jurists to try and get more judges through, even if they're not going to be exactly the kind of people she would pick with Senate control. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, and it's something we saw with President Obama when he got in, and he took a lot of heat from his own side over being really conciliatory toward Republicans. I think we're going to see that. This is going to be a very contested election. It's as you can tell, the stress level in this country is off the charts. She's going to want to do everything she can to really kind of ease the transition. And I think reaching out to Republicans is going to be one of those things. And look, she used to be in the Senate and she knows several of these lawmakers. So I think we can absolutely see more of that.
Of course, she was one of the furthest left members.
Yes, she was. Yeah, she was.
I don't know how many close relationships she has.
They all go to lunch together. We know.
That's true. Sure. And look, I think practically she would have to probably moderate some of her judge picks just to try and move some through and not waste 2 years of constantly having to battle every single pick. But that will be a strategy question, I think, because on both sides, like whether it's worth Republicans fighting every single pick or whether it's worth Harris trying to moderate some to get peel off a couple Republican votes. We'll see. Yeah. And that'll probably largely, like you said, depend on the political atmosphere in either party after the election, if she does win.
Yeah. With the Supreme Court, if a vacancy came up there, it's going to be really contested and really pitched.
Yeah. That certainly seems to be the case. And I will say the two oldest members of the court are Republican appointees. Yes. So while we don't have any indication that they're in poor health or anything like that, you would think that the oldest members are the most likely to be replaced at any given moment. And so it could certainly become, especially, if there's a chance of flipping from Republican appointee to Democratic appointee, it's going to be, as we've seen the last several cycles, probably very contentious.
Yes.
And consequential. That's going to be, I think the judge appointments are the most consequential things. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, especially on this issue.
Okay.
I mean, this is where there are thousands of cases going through the courts. Gun laws are being challenged at every level because of the new history and tradition test. So this is the show. Yeah.
And a lot of the districts, the level, the appeals courts level right below the Supreme Court, those there's potential to shake up the balance of appointees on there as well for whoever becomes the next president. So it is certainly a high priority for people who consider gun policy as a major part of their vote. This is probably where you would want to pay the most attention to what could practically be different between these two administrations, potential administrations.
Absolutely, yeah.
But it's not the only thing, right? The next obvious place to go is executive orders, right? And so let's say Trump gets in. This is a large part of what your piece focused on. What do you see as the things he could do from an executive order standpoint?
So the three most controversial executive orders that President Biden released were the first batch in 2021, the pistol brace rule, the ghost gun rule, and engaged in the business. The ATF clarified the definition of who needs to get a license to sell guns, effectively trying to close the private sales loophole without going through Congress. So these are the things that President Trump is going to roll back almost immediately. His team said
that specifically, right?
Yeah.
And
I mean,
we
they're
don't
going
have
to
to
go
argue
through.
about it. whether it's a loophole or not is obviously a
right.
debate. But,
you know what? Actually, you're right, because it's not technically a loophole. That has gone for so long, that terminology. It's literally like the 90s gun sale loophole. I mean, this terminology is old enough to drink. So it's a private sales exception gap. Or whatever.
Yeah, they regulate commercial sales, and they don't regulate, federal law doesn't regulate non-commercial sales.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Obviously, you're right about the consequences of it are the same, however you describe it, but I'm always a stickler for those things.
No, totally.
But yeah, so those are the three big executive orders. They've come up against a lot of resistance in the courts, although the Supreme Court just held oral arguments on the ghost gun one, or privately, the new frames and receivers rule, and honestly seemed fairly sympathetic towards the ATF's view of it. So we'll have to see what they do on it. But yeah, I mean, Trump has said, I will undo these, and he can, right? Because these are just executive orders. Yes,
I mean they're
rules, I guess.
Right.
It's a little different.
And
like
the engaged in the business thing, like that. That was something that his team told America's First Freedom is second on the list after the judges. I mean, they really are going to go through line by line, essentially, and see what they can undo. And you can expect them doing that during the transition. So they're going to be ready on day one.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's something to expect him to follow through. We talked a little bit about him getting kind of open to compromise or whatever, new laws after mass shootings. But this one seems like something I think you would definitely expect he would actually go through and do immediately, is undoing stuff that Biden has done. I mean, he also just seems to really dislike Joe Biden as well as part of the motivation for it. But also, like, this is a priority for a lot of people in the gun industry and the gun rights movement side of things. And he seems in tune with that and will do that. And then it's not just the orders, though. There's also other actions he can take as president through the executive branch, right? Through agencies. And what do you expect to see there?
Well, this is he also, by the way, the executive orders also ordered kind of a crackdown on inspections. They've ramped up inspections and license revocations.
Yeah, zero tolerance rules. Yeah,
right. Zero tolerance. President Trump can absolutely put the brakes on that, and I fully expect him to, because it has taken a lot of heat in the gun community. But in terms of writing his own, what's funny? He is going to unwind everything Biden did. I didn't really see anything that told me that he was ready to write new laws. It really is about peeling away regulations.
New rules, yeah.
New rules. Well, that's debatable. Some people say these rules are lawmaking, and that's interesting that, we had the Chevron decision. So the ghost gun oral arguments, it is interesting that they seemed receptive to the ATF rulemaking in general.
Yeah, they did.
So that is interesting. But I can't really see him. I'm not really sure what he could get in executive orders. Could he write some kind of national concealed carry reciprocity through there?
I mean, that's where I guess you go back to the first term.
Right.
And he didn't really, the only executive action he took on guns, especially through like the rulemaking process, was the bump stock ban.
Right.
Which has kind of been the template for most of these Biden rules as well. Yeah. So he did spike at the very end of his administration, there was an attempt by the ATF to do the braces rule that got spiked.
Right.
But that's not writing in new like rules that are favorable towards the industry. I think he did move oversight of exports and imports of firearms from
he did.
State Department to the Commerce Department. So that was that's something. Maybe he can do something more in those. But he hasn't really talked about anything that I've seen, at least on that detailed level of here are some of the rules that I would do. And he just talked about getting rid of Biden. And to that end, I think in the same vein, he wants to get rid of the ATF director, right?
Yes, he does. He wants to appoint. He said he wants to sack Steve Dettelbach, and he wants to appoint a pro-gun ATF director who is going to value, personal protection over, public considerations, et cetera. And also an attorney general. And that attorney general appointment will be key. He wants to do a number of things in terms of, he wants to make federal funding for law enforcement contingent upon arrests and prosecutions. These things affect gun violence, and violent crime. He wants to do a lot in that arena that will filter down into how gun laws are being enforced by the ATF.
Yeah. Dettelbach has obviously been a controversial figure in the gun industry.
Right.
He was a AG in Ohio, a Democratic AG, right? I think he lost the AG's election, if I remember correctly. He was a U.S. attorney, and then he ran to be Ohio AG and as a Democrat, and then he lost that. And he was the backup to Chipman, who was the more controversial figure. But he was still somebody that I think has been viewed as political by the gun industry. And
which is interesting because he has a partnership with the NSSF. So the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act gave $1 million to the NSSF for suicide prevention, I believe. And so there is like a partnership there.
There always has been, right? To some
always,
degree,
yeah. So the ATF really has two masters. The ATF has the gun industry that it has to regulate, but it also has a relationship with the gun industry, and that's that's something important too. And I actually went on Instagram. Dettelbach was posing with NSSF, so he's been way more low key, I think, than David Chipman would have been, who had come from a gun advocacy organization. And so, but he still does not pass muster. He's not going to make it to the next round. I think that's clear.
I think it's pretty clear that the industry and the gun rights groups like the NRA view Dettelbach as political and do not want him to be ATF director in spite of some of the things you're talking about here. Like, I think that's a very clear position among industry officials and gun rights advocates.
Right.
But the other interesting thing though about this is obviously he can do that. He can fire the ATF director like he did the FBI director the first time around. The interesting thing though is kind of thinking about replacing him, because Dettelbach became the permanent ATF director after there were a series of active directors, including during the entirety of the Trump administration. It was all acting directors. Trump did try to appoint a permanent director when he was president. And interestingly, his nominee failed due to Republican opposition. I believe Ted Cruz was the one who went after the Trump's nominee during the nomination process, during the confirmation hearings, because they thought that Trump's nominee was too unfriendly towards the gun industry as well. So I don't know, like, it'd be interesting to see if we get to that point, he doesn't have a track record of putting up ATF directors that the industry was happy with. So, he didn't try again after that point either, right?
Republicans would like to see no ATF director. I'll be honest with you. They want to see it move back under Treasury. And I think that would dilute some of their enforcement and budget, certainly.
Do you think that's a realistic thing that could happen in the Trump administration? They get sort of demoted as an agency back under control of Treasury?
Yes, I do. I think that is definitely, Project 2025, which has Trump people in it, even though Trump has not adopted it as his platform. That was one of their proposals, is to move it back under Treasury. But I've heard that for years. That's nothing new. That's a priority. And look, having acting directors, I mean, people are like, well, the agency's running, right? And yes, absolutely. But they don't quite have the heft of a permanent Senate confirmed director. And I think, with Harris, if she wins, we might see a lot of acting directors because they won't get confirmed. And I think that the Senate might take an equally tough tack with him. Look, the truth is that Republicans adore Trump's followers, but sometimes Trump is not the right-wing stalwart that they expect him to be. And without another election hanging over his head, this is his last term, the wheels can come off and he could really do what he wants. So we could see a mixture of, policies that run the gamut, really.
Yeah, that's probably fair to say as a possibility. And so going back to Harris, if she wins, what's realistic to expect from her on executive actions? Like, is one of the things I wonder is, like, they've kind of already gone after a lot of the obvious gray areas with these rules that the Biden administration has already done. Do you expect to? I mean, I would imagine people can come up with all kinds of ideas. Have you heard of any particular rules that she might try to propose if she's elected?
I haven't, but I think we can expect, the executive orders that Biden issued, in batches over the years really are clarifications to, strengthening and tightening the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. So I think we'll see executive actions that just kind of, take the existing ones and just go a little bit farther. I'm pretty sure the Harris, potential Harris administration expects the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention to be shuttered. Now, that is something that Vice President Harris is in charge of. And I think saying
they would shutter that if she was elected.
I'm sorry, if Trump was elected.
Right.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's almost.
It's a tough week, folks.
But under Harris, it would probably
under
stick
Harris,
around,
it would stick around, and she would handpick a successor, and she knows that job very well. I think that is something. And look, they don't have enforcement ability. They don't make laws. They don't enforce laws. But what it is a central clearinghouse for all of their gun violence messaging and policy. So I think we could expect to see that continue. And under a Trump administration, it wouldn't, or it would be used for something else. Some other kind of information. Process. That's fair. Distribution process. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so, but you don't have any ideas on specific rules that she hasn't talked about. I mean, she definitely hasn't talked about it. Any sort of
guns have really not been a part of this election. And I know that your viewers have probably noticed too. Like, I remember 2016 when we had both sides of the ticket wide open. Guns were being used by candidates on either side to kind of against when we were winnowing down the primary candidates. That was definitely, I remember Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders went at it over guns. So now, we all know where each side falls on guns. They're dug in. I don't think we're going to see many surprises. Her priorities legislatively are going to be, we're going to hear universal background checks, assault weapon ban, things that really aren't, practical, to be honest with you. But I haven't heard anything specific. Congress, but I think we'll just see, a doubling down of what we already have, continuing Biden's executive orders. And you're right. They've kind of, I don't really think there's many areas left that they can do without Congress. It's limited.
I mean, I do. It does seem like they maybe have already done most of the ones that they could. I mean, even the latest one, even the in the business gun dealer thing that you mentioned earlier, where they're basically trying to get more people to have to get licenses to sell their used guns as a sort of workaround to universal background checks. Even that is kind of a rehash of what Obama had tried to do. Right.
Remember that?
Yeah. I mean, the ATF under Obama had come out and said it could be as few as one gun sold that make you in the business technically. But the practical impact of it was never that significant. And I don't know. It just already feels like they're kind of reaching on some of these ones anyway.
And he did it when he had one foot out the door. And honestly, the government has never quantified the number of guns. And I think
and they don't want
that's probably a problem. No, they don't want to. Yeah.
They want to have the leeway to say, based on the circumstances, you should have had a license, not based on how many guns were sold in a period of time or whatever. But because that's the broadest view of the statute, and the statute hasn't changed, and it's very unlikely to change, as we've mentioned. So that's probably the best they can do. And then also they have to, in theory, they'd have to defend these rules in court if they were to try and prosecute people under them.
So, and that's where the judges come in.
But I guess there is one suggestion that I've heard from gun control activists is that they had wanted this already, and the Biden administration didn't do this when they created the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. They wanted the head of that to be a cabinet secretary position, right? That seems to have not obviously didn't happen. Maybe that. Do you think that's something that could happen? That's something that I've heard that hasn't happened yet that maybe Harris does. I don't know.
I haven't. But then again, we haven't heard much about guns from in this race. But honestly, I mean, they waited 2 years to even mount this Office of Gun Violence Prevention.
Right.
I can't really see them. I don't know. Something tells me that she's going to want to just kind of play it moderate and not jump in, guns blazing, and start making this part of the infrastructure. They did wait so long. It really feels like she's probably not going to make a move like that, at least not within the first couple of years of her administration.
Yeah, although one of the reasons that this hasn't been a major issue in the election, and one of the things we haven't perhaps seen more movement on this from the administration of late is just the general lack of mass shootings or high profile gun violence over the last year has not brought this issue to the forefront and forced them to try and do something or say something or move something around. So that I think is where that's when you'd wonder, like, okay, here's when they might start to come up with something outside of what they've already done and push towards something different. That's my thought, at least on she hasn't had to come out and have really detailed, neither has he, right? I think the same reason being that this has not been a focus, and that's in part because a lot of the times that we spend talking about gun policy on the national level are in the aftermath of a mass shooting, and we just have not had a high profile mass shooting, right? Like ones that capture the nation's attention. Right. And we simply have not had many of those this entire year.
Right. The last high casualty event was Lewiston, Maine a year ago. And then we had the Kansas City Super Bowl parade shooting, which had 2 fatalities and a number injured. Yeah. And then, thankfully, we haven't had an event like that makes lawmakers, that puts them on the hot seat.
Yeah, the closest thing during the meat of the election was there are 2 things. Really.
The assassination attempt.
The assassination attempt, which was on one of the candidates who happened to be the ostensibly more pro-gun one, obviously.
Right.
So he didn't react in a way that made him shift his policies at all. So it kind of didn't become a major gun policy story. And then you had the Georgia high school shooting as well. But that also didn't. Right. It wasn't the same level of horror as we've seen before, and so it didn't break through as much, I guess.
And that's the name of the game in news, isn't it? That's the name. Unfortunately, it's how many people are dead. Yeah.
Yes. Unfortunately, that's not the best way for us to have gun policy discussions, but it is a reality of how this often occurs. That's when people pay attention. And so people aren't really paying attention because we haven't had a lot of those things. And so there's been pretty stagnant on gun policy, and we haven't gotten a ton of detail on these things. We have a pretty good idea generally of where either candidate is and so forth. But yeah, details certainly short on either way. And so some of this stuff is just speculating on from our combined knowledge of following these events. But I think we did a pretty good job of probably working through what the realistic possibilities are, barring, unprecedented situations, right? Because if it's unprecedented, it's very hard to predict what could happen. But if things stayed relatively similar to how they've been recently, and you get a Harris or Trump administration, this is how it seems likely things will go. And the biggest, so I guess bottom line, some of this stuff, the biggest areas of potential difference in reality, in practice, at least for the first 2 years until you get another election cycle, that might change the makeup of Congress, are probably in judge appointments and perhaps and executive actions of some kind, whether it's changing personnel at the ATF or moving the ATF around, although I think that would require legislation to do, right?
Right.
So, but changing ATF funding or ATF, things with the ATF, you get more leeway there. And then, executive actions of some kind, whether it's repealing the ones that the Biden administration has put in or trying to come up with new ones on top of those. That's where the real meat will be on gun policy, right?
Yeah, I definitely think so. There is one wild card, something we haven't discussed, is that Trump is a gunshot victim now. And I'm sure that he's traumatized from that. And I'm wondering if that does factor anyone, right? And I'm wondering if that would factor into, I heard a lot of talk about when that happened, how did this person get a gun? Well, he didn't have a criminal history, but there were behavioral markers. So I am hearing a lot of, why don't our background checks cover this? And so maybe, that might give him pause somehow. I don't know what he would do about that. I don't think we can strengthen criminal background checks and just start adding criteria willy-nilly. But that is something to think about. If he does ask himself, how are these people able to get guns even though they haven't committed a crime? That might lead him on a path that we haven't even thought of yet.
Yeah, I mean, there's always possibility that there's some proposal outside of the normal discourse that we hear around gun policies, where most of positions on your traditional gun proposals are pretty hardened, whether it's universal background checks or assault weapons ban or national reciprocity or whatever. There's pretty stable, solidified positions on those things. And there's always a possibility that something beyond, I think one of the things they talked about after Parkland that came out of the Trump White House, the idea of a universal background check system, but one that was something you could have an app that you would be able to somehow check make sure the person you're selling a gun to doesn't have a criminal record, because that's one of the something that private gun sellers might be interested in using. Yeah. Right. But can't actually do. As a private gun seller, you don't have access to NICS. You'd have to go to
and that's something I agree. The public should have access to NICS. There are people who don't know they have prohibitors in their background. Sure. And I think that we should all be able to check our backgrounds, because that could be a crime.
And there's obvious privacy issues with that too. But that's
we should be able to get our own background,
sure.
Like our own
or have some sort of way of privatizing the information inside of the check while still showing whether or not the person is prohibited.
Right.
There's obviously ideas beyond what we normally talk about. And I guess that's what you're getting at. Like maybe there's something there that could come up. And that is a possibility. And I do think that, and I wrote about this at the time, that assassination attempts and assassinations of political figures have led to major gun law changes in the United States over the recent history, right? The last 30, 40 years. That's when you're seeing major gun bills pass, even if it isn't the person who was like Reagan. Right. Was the Brady bill was the result of that assassination attempt, but it didn't pass under Reagan. Right. So there's some things to consider. It's just those are longer shot things. Right.
And look, Trump is a businessman. If he is elected for a second term, maybe he convenes a gun CEO roundtable and they start talking about ideas. You never know.
You don't know. And I think that goes back to the point of after Parkland, what you saw him do was a roundtable. It was with lawmakers, but it was something that wouldn't necessarily fit with your traditional NRA backed politician, would not have necessarily done what he did after Parkland. So he could, you never know what he might do. I do think he is, or at least up to this point has been very much considers what his voters, his core supporters like and don't like. And that probably also hinders him from wanting to adopt any new gun restrictions, but not totally. It doesn't totally put him off the idea, but So I still think at the end of the day, with either of these candidates, the most likely thing you're going to see in their administrations is of significance on guns is going to be judge appointments and executive actions.
Absolutely.
Those are the areas where they're going to have more power and leeway to do things. Legislation is going to be much more difficult.
For sure.
So, all right. Well, hey, look, I appreciate you joining the show and giving us your opinion and your point of view and your reporting on this and analysis. I think it's great to have differing perspectives, like I said, and I thought we got to some really interesting stuff there, and I think it's informative for people. So I appreciate you doing this, and tell people where they can find more of your reporting if they want to read it.
Thetrace.org. And we welcome all readers, including hate readers. Actually, some of the most productive conversations I've had on Twitter have been with pro-gun advocates. So we have a surprising amount of common ground. I think we all agree that we don't want gun violence to go up. We just disagree about how that could happen. So, I'm choosing to look on the bright side. We have a lot of common ground in this country. So,
well, hey, I appreciate your perspective because it's different from mine, and I think that makes me and the audience a bit better informed. So,
thank you.
People can judge for themselves and make up their own minds, and I encourage them to read the piece that you wrote that we talked about to get a better understanding of the world and what the stakes are for this election, what the likely outcomes are. So. Again, thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to hand it off to myself to tell people a little bit about another outlet that does good reporting, The Dispatch. We're doing an ad swap, and they're our sponsor again this week. So headed over there. This week, we're doing another ad swap with The Dispatch. We have a free 30-day trial over at The Dispatch for any Reload reader who wants to give them a try. And I think it makes a lot of sense because we tend to focus on the same things. Of course, The Dispatch has... in addition to reporting, a lot of opinion and analysis from big name folks you probably heard of, Steve Hayes, Jonah Goldberg, Olive Pundit. And there's a lot of guys over there that have been major players in the center-right conservative media space for a long time and who I enjoy reading quite a bit. But in addition to their opinion and editorial work, they have a distinct focus on facts first reporting, on hard news in the same way that we do here at The Reload. And I think that if you like the reporting we do, if you like our approach, you will probably enjoy the Dispatch and their approach. And they're an even bigger publication than we are, with more resources, with a wider view, of course, of politics. They go into a lot more areas than we do. And so I think they're just a really good resource, and you should check them out. Sign up for that 30-day free trial. Give it a try. Been a paying member since they were founded, and I highly recommend them. So head over to The Dispatch today to check out what they have to offer. We have a link, of course, in the description and on our website to the 30-day free trial. So give it a try. See what you like.